Hello and welcome to the Little Woman podcast. Before entering the podcast, I wanted to let you all know that Little Woman podcast now has merchandise available at society6.com/littlewomanpodcast. There you will find stickers, posters, mugs and t-shirts to fulfill all your Little Woman needs. Come and check it out. Link is also in the description. And now, to the podcast.
Maybe Leslie's lifestyle was something that Louisa did not like, but more likely the reason is the pressure that was put upon her to write things that she did not feel comfortable. Magazine mostly ran sensational stories of murderers, executions, prize fights, wars and assassinations. If you read Louisa's stories that she wrote during this time, these are not her themes. Neither are these stories horrible or immoral. It reminds me of a discussion I had with Emily, and Emily said that Louisa May Alcott herself is quite an elitist. You can see that in her writings, even from young age. She included moral teachings to her stories. Most of her themes are in fact women who have a great deal of emotional distress. Goethean stress and thunder tales. But as you can hear from that paragraph, Mr. Leslie wanted everything to be more shocking, more disturbing, and preferably without no morals, because that is what sells. This becomes a big internal conflict within Jo, because she wants to make a living with her writing, but she is working for a magazine which main selling points are murders, executions and scandals, and those are not the things that Jo wants to write about. Quote, Jo hardly knew her own MS, again so crumbled and underscored were its pages and paragraphs, but feeling as a tender parent might on being asked to cut off her baby's legs in order that it might fit into a new cradle. She looked at the marked passages and was surprised to find that all the moral reflections, which she had carefully put in as a ballast for much romance, had been stricken out. But sir, I thought every story should have some sort of a moral, so I took care to have few of my sinners repent. Mr. Dashwood's editorial gravity relaxed into a smile, for Jo had forgotten her friend, and spoken as only an author could. People want to be amused, not preached at. You know, morals don't sell nowadays, which was not quite a correct statement, by the way. Not only is Jo's story rejected because of the morals, Louisa, who is the narrator, also makes a point, quite cheekily, saying that the editor is wrong. Morals do sell. Louisa's most well-known book, Little Woman, is based on characters' moral growth. In this chapter, narrator also points out that Jo as a writer is dispensable, and that if she is not fit to be their writer, she is easily removed and replaced. She needs to write her stories so that they fit into the magazine's agenda. This does not work for Jo, because Jo has actually very strong morals. But Mr. Dashwood rejected anything but thrilling tales, and as thrills could not be produced except by harrowing up the souls of the readers, history and romance, land and sea, science and art, police records and lunatic asylums had to be ransacked. For the purpose, Jo soon found that her innocent experience had given her but few glimpses of the tragic world which underlies society. She thought she was prospering finely, but unconsciously she was beginning to desecrate some of the womanliest attributes of a woman's character. She was living in a bad society, and imaginary though it was, its influence affected her, for she was feeding heart and fancy on a dangerous and unsubstantial food, and was fast brushing the innocent bloom from her nature by a premature acquaintance with the darker side of life, which comes soon enough to all of us. I'm going to read you some quotes from Lorraine Tosiello's novel, Only Gossip Prospers. This book takes place in the time when Louisa was in her 50s and she was visiting New York for health treatments. This book is historical fiction. The crowd bustled as a curious entourage crossed the far end of the square. At the center of the maelstrom stood a debonair man with a beautiful woman in his arm. He seemed to be barking orders and suggestions to the men around him. Some peeled off on errands and others jotted notes as he spoke. From his bowler hat to his buttoned boots, the man exuded charisma. He sported a broad plaid jacket, 2 fobbed watches and an unkempt beard. There was a thrill of energy, of imperative motion about him. Louisa drew in her breath and turned her head sharply away from. The woman in his arm was not young, She was glamorous, but seemed made of steel. She had a presence that declared she belonged in the turmoil, in fact, that she thrived on it. At times the man turned to ask her a question, then nodded at her reply and barked it to the lackey nearby. They approached closer to the bench where Louisa sat. "Mr. Leslie," someone called out to him. Louisa drew in her breath and turned her head sharply away from the scene. Frank Leslie, and then the woman at his side must be Miriam Square Leslie, his wife. They were among the most notorious newspaper people in the land, not only for their often torturing reports, but for the scandalous way they conducted their lives. They had openly lived together along with her first husband and co-editor for 10 years. The gossip was that Mrs. Square herself had finally set up her first husband in a scandal with prostitutes, and then had it reported in Leslie's paper. She divorced him for the escapade, committed him to a madhouse, and went to marry Frank Leslie. Frank Leslie was just as flamboyant and titillating as his publications, frequently evolved in the city's gossip. 2 years before he had been indicted for obscenity. He published a rag called The Day's Doings, which concentrated on romantic license, wayward women, and any other tantalizing bit of scandal he could dredge up. But it was the suggestive, lascivious personal advertisements in the back pages that got him into trouble. Louisa had seen the columns of print devoted to treatments for venereal disease, lewd books, marriage manuals with illustrations. Leslie had beaten obscenity charges over those advertisements and seemed to have come out of the scuffle with no repercussions on his own notoriety, but his wild assertions and virulent prose could damn another's reputation. Frank Leslie did have a larger-than-life reputation. I guess we could call him as the Rupert Murdoch of 19th century. He was a real person. Mr. Dashwood in Little Woman is a caricature of him. It is ironic that somebody who exposed and created scandals for a living eventually got caught up into one themselves and didn't find a way out of it. Leslie's 2 sons owned parts of the company and they were in competition with one another, and when Leslie died, his widow started to fight over the company. It sounds a very complicated family drama. Louisa's love for Henry Thoreau, and especially their relationship with young Ladislas Wisniewski, it could have been a scandal if people had found out about it. That is why Louisa tried to censor all the notions about her love affairs from her journals. And following what happened to Frank Leslie, see him being destroyed by the gossip, seeing him destroying people because of gossip that he created, that actually might have contributed to Louisa's decision to guard her reputation even more. People have made all kinds of theories why Louisa left Frank Leslie's newspaper. When I was reading Louisa's diaries, I came across something that also happens in Little Woman. The narrator points out that doing the research for these stories actually begin to cause Jo mental health problems. She comes across stories that make her feel disgusted and give her anxiety. And this is a diary marking from Louisa. November proof began to come, and the chapter seemed small, stupid, and no more my own print. I felt very much afraid that I'd ventured too much and should be sorry for it. But Emerson says, quote, that what is true for your own private heart is true for others. So I wrote from my own consciousness and observation and hope it may suit someone and at least do no harm. She says that after the proofread, the editor's notes, she cannot recognize her own story, and she also mentions that Emerson has encouraged her to write something that she feels to be true in her heart, and then Louisa says that she has done just that. I love finding this quote because that is almost word to word what happens in Little Woman. In Little Woman, Friedrich encourages Jo to leave the magazine and write something that she is happy and comfortable with. Louisa herself, even when she was in her 20s, didn't put much value to her pot-boiler stories. Like Jo in the book, she called them trash. But I have read them. They are not terrible. Maybe because she doesn't have respect for the publication where the stories were appearing, she didn't put that much heart into them. Waldo Emerson was Louisa's next-door neighbor and very influential figure in her life. Louisa called Emerson as her Goethe. This is a quote from Alcott scholar Susan Bailey. It is not a secret that Louisa had a girlhood crush on Emerson, and if Bear is based on him, then her affection for him was deep and authentic. Based on my research, Friedrich is a mixed character who is based on several men who Louisa loved and admired. When it comes to Friedrich being Jo's supporter and mentor figure, when it comes to her writing, that we can trace to Johann Wolfgang Goethe and Walter Emerson. This is a quote from Megan Armknecht. Emerson was more than just a neighbor. For Louisa he was her idol. When Anna Alcott married John Pratt, the Emerson family was present. Alcott, then 27, wrote in her journal that Mr. Emerson kissed her, Anna Alcott, and I thought that honor would make even matrimony endurable, for he is the god of my idolatry, and has been for years. Emerson's kindness and friendship towards the Alcott family only deepened Alcott's love for him. She looked to him in everything and regarded his advice as, quote, the best inspiration of my life. When Emerson died, 49-year-old Alcott described him as, quote, the man who has helped me most by his life, his books, his society. I can never tell all he has been to me from the time I was a little girl. When Jo goes to meet Mr. Dashwood for the first time, she actually says that she has a friend who is willing to write these stories for his magazine. Jo is so ashamed of what she's doing, she doesn't even present herself as a writer to the editor, and she uses pseudonyms when writing her stories. Jo is really afraid that the family would find out. She gets really scared, especially when she thinks what Mommy would think about her or what she would say. I think from that you can see how serious it is for Jo, because Mommy is someone who Jo always wants to be honest with, and they could speak about anything. Before Jo has final breakup from the weekly volcano, there is a very important event before that, and that is the symposium. Jo and Friedrich attend a symposium together, and Jo is really excited to go there. But after a while, she begins to see that these people who she has been admiring from distance are just regular people. Her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took some time to recover that the great creatures were only man and woman after all. In New York, Jo begins to observe people more by their character than their wealth, looks, or possession. I know lots of Little Women fans whose favorite scene in the entire novel is the symposium, and the more I have read it, I think it is the time when Jo actually begins to fall in love with Friedrich. This is where the Christianity comes in. In the symposium, Jo sees one young man starting to speak about atheism and questioning the existence of God. You have to remember that Jo is very religious. Her father is literally a pastor. Jo is blown away by what's happening, and the narrator mentions that her world turned upside down. Jo was quite shocked and upset and didn't know what to think, and then Friedrich started to speak for religion. He blazed up with honest indignation and defended religion with all the eloquence of truth, an eloquence which made his broken English musical and his plain face beautiful. Somehow as he talked, the word got right again. To Jo, the old beliefs that had lasted so long seemed better than the new. God was not a blind force, and immortality was not a pretty fable but a blessed fact. She felt as if she had solid ground under her feet again, and when Mr. Bear paused, out-talked, but not one whit convinced, Jo wanted to clap her hands and thank him. How can anyone not love Friedrich after that? This is also where Friedrich is no longer a German philosopher. He actually becomes an American philosopher, because during this time period there was a rising school of atheism going on in the circle of the German intellects. Friedrich, who is German, is in this case a lot more closer to Louisa May Alcott's transcendentalist worldview and philosophers like Thoreau and Emerson. Louisa was a highly spiritual person. Transcendentalism, it was a bit different compared to the mainstream Christianity of the time, because the transcendentalists were somewhat pantheistic. They believed that nature was the ultimate manifestation of God, and they were also somewhat pacifistic and quite tolerant when it came to other religions. For example, Louisa's father was accused of being Buddhist when Louisa was a child. Louisa was somewhat a spiritual seeker through her life. When it came to romance and love, she saw that the spiritual connection between two people was as important as anything else. That was a big part of Louisa's relationship with Henry Thoreau. This is a quote from blogger Skirmish Wit and Lit. I come back to Thoreau's work a lot when I'm feeling existential. He has such a lovely way of contextualizing complex thoughts about life in his poems. She was properly attracted to his existential musings, and the spark they shared likely came from the intellectual stimulation and being able to talk about life's big questions together. The symposium is 100% connected to Jo's development as a writer. It is all about her starting to put more thoughts on her characters and the messages that she wants to say in her works. The adaptations they show Jo and Friedrich arguing, which doesn't happen in the novel, but they have never adapted the symposium. What happens is that Friedrich sees a copy of Weekly Volcano, and he expresses his dislike about sensationalism. Jo is a bit upset, but she is not upset with Friedrich. She is upset with herself. Ever since she started to write those potboiler stories, she has had this inner battle about it. She doesn't particularly enjoy the process. The publisher keeps erasing the parts that she likes, and the payment is not that great. Friedrich compares reading sensationalism almost has the same effect as if he would give gunpowder for his nephews. If we take a look at this bit deeper, a couple of years back, maybe you remember, there was a lot of talk about the way giant social media companies had spread false information online before elections in different parts of the world, and also give platforms for hate speech. And they only agreed to censor themselves when the advertisers said that they were going to leave the platform. That is exactly what happened on YouTube a couple of years ago. In the 19th century, that was the way the sensational press was working. Louisa May Alcott, being a transcendentalist, abolitionist, and a promoter of gender equality, would have had very serious moral questions. What are the platforms that she was okay to work with?